As the fall season is practically upon us and the pumpkin spice gods are already blessing us with their bounty, it's time to get your garden ready for the changing weather. Fall gardening can look very different depending on your climate, but no matter where you live, the changing seasons means there are some important tasks that we need to attend to for the success of our garden now and into the spring. Today on Just Grow Something, we're tackling your fall garden checklist. Whether you're buttoning up the garden for winter, transitioning into a cool season planting cycle, or continuing to harvest year-round, today's episode breaks down fall gardening tasks for 3 different groups of gardeners: zones 3 and 4, zones 5 through 9, and zones 10 and 11. Let's dig in. Hey, I'm Karen. I started gardening in a small corner of my suburban backyard, and now 18 years later, I've got a degree in horticulture and operate a 40-acre market farm. I believe there is power in food and that everyone should know how to grow at least a little bit of their own. On this podcast, I share evidence-based techniques to help you plant, grow, harvest, and store all your family's favorites. Consider me your friend in the garden. So, grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something. If you have not taken a moment to go and vote for this podcast in the Women in Podcasting Awards, this is your last week to do so. This is a People's Choice type of an award, and I am up against some really stiff competition, so each and every vote counts. None of us nominees has any idea how many votes we have or our standings until the competition is over. So if you've already voted, I truly, truly appreciate you. If you have not, I will leave a link in the episode description. It's also in this morning's email. You can go to womeninpodcasting.net/awards and find me in the list under the lifestyle category. We should get final results after voting closes. I don't know whether or not it's going to show us where our standings were or just show us who the winners are, but fingers crossed that I'm on that winners list. This is also your last week to send me the answer to the question of the month. What was your biggest success in the garden this year? If you're watching on YouTube, just type your answer in the comments below. If you're in Spotify, you can do the same thing there in the discussion or reply to today's email from your inbox. You can send me a DM, however you want to reach me. I haven't had too many responses to this one, so either you all had a really crappy gardening season or you're all just really busy with your fall gardens. But take a moment, please, and let me know, and I will reveal your answers and give you mine in October. So here in West Central Missouri, we are about 3 weeks away from our average first frost date. I know many of you who are further north of me have already experienced your first frost or pretty darn close, and I am so sorry. I cannot imagine having such a short growing season. But those of you who are further south of me and in more tropical regions, you may not ever see a frost. Ever. So that's why I broke down this task list by hardiness zone. What I experience here headed into fall is way different from what someone in Minnesota is facing or what someone in Hawaii is facing. And I did this by hardiness zone just because it's a good indicator of how cold it gets in your area. And there are plenty of places where one part of the state or the province has a drastically different climate than another one. So this makes it easy to reference. So we're going to start with my gardeners in zones 3 and 4. So Minneapolis, Minnesota, Helena, Montana, you people. In these colder zones, fall is more a preparation for winter than anything else. Your first frost may have already hit, or it may very well be fast approaching. So, first things first, if you haven't already, pick any remaining frost-sensitive crops like your tomatoes, your peppers, beans, curcubus, anything. If you have green tomatoes that are on the vine and they are fully mature, meaning they are solidly green, they just haven't gotten red yet, you can absolutely ripen those indoors. So harvest them, bring them inside, and you can ripen those up. Even if you have small green ones that aren't fully mature yet, those can be used for things like green tomato chutney or whatever. They're never really going to ripen. They'll just kind of rot before they get to that point because they're not fully mature. But that doesn't mean you can't use them for something. Now, your root crops like carrots and beets and, parsnips, those types of things can actually stay in the ground a little bit longer, but you want to be sure to harvest them before the ground actually freezes solid. Now, if you have cold hardy vegetables out there, so things that are frost tolerant like kale or spinach or Brussels sprouts, or even those root crops like the leeks and the parsnips and that sort of thing, you can use cold frames or row covers to sort of extend the harvest season for those types of things. Because your daylight hours are going to start dropping, they're not really going to continue actively growing too much. But if they've gotten really close to maturity, you can kind of leave them in this sort of stasis and be able to continue harvesting them after your first frost if you can protect them in some way. So, in your things like carrots and leeks and parsnips, they actually improve in flavor after a frost. So it's a good idea to leave them out there. Just make sure that they're not actually freezing completely solid. So make sure that you have cold frames, row covers, extra layers of mulch on hand. So that's another thing that you want to do. You want to mulch any bare soil to protect it from erosion, and it's going to protect it from becoming more compacted over the winter months. This also helps retain moisture in the soil. And if you're using an organic mulch, so straw or pine needles, even wood chips, that is going to begin to break down where it is in contact with the soil. So that's just going to actually add more nutrients, and it's going to improve the soil texture for what happens in spring. So your perennials too, strawberries, those are especially important to get mulched around the base, because that's going to insulate those crowns and keep them protected from those really harsh winter temperatures. If you need to, you can also use additional things like your row covers or your cold frames to protect them even further, depending on what your lowest average temperature is during the winter time. Now, the good thing is right now is the best time to be planting your garlic and your spring flowering bulbs. So late fall, perfect time to plant garlic. You want to get this done before the ground freezes. We want the cloves to be able to establish their roots a bit before that happens. And this is going to give you a head start in the spring, because they're just going to naturally come to life when it's time. So if you have not done that yet, now is the best time to be doing that before the ground becomes too cold. This is also the same time to be doing like spring flowering bulbs like tulips and daffodils, which would be really nice once winter subsides. They just naturally come up on their own, and they're great. If it is possible, now is also the time to be adding compost or other organic matter into your garden beds before the ground freezes, especially if you need to turn that in. You don't necessarily have to turn it in. I tend to just throw compost and my other amendments just on top of the soil and naturally let it sit there over the winter and start to break down. But if your soil is kind of needing a little extra help, or you've got a lot of clay in there that you're trying to loosen up, you might want to turn it in, which means you need to do that before the ground freezes. So this will give the organic material some time to break down, and it will help improve that soil quality by spring. This is also a really good time to be gathering up all of your garden tools and getting them cleaned and sort of disinfected and oiled if you need to, and getting them put away for winter storage. Also draining all of your hoses and storing those in a dry place to keep them from being damaged from freezing temperatures. And of course, once kind of all that is done, now's a really good time to just sort of reflect back on what worked in the garden this year, what didn't work, what successes you had, what didn't go so well. It's fresh in your memory. So even if you're not sitting down to actually lay out your garden plan and do your crop rotations and your seed orders just yet, at least taking some notes in a journal of some sort will give you an idea when you do go back of what actually happened this year, because it's fresh in your mind, right? And so you can actually make some very accurate notes rather than a month or two from now sitting down and going, okay, so how did X, Y, and Z work? Your memory is just not going to be that fresh, right? So now's a really good time, because it also gives you a little bit more of a realistic look at whether or not you want to consider expanding or changing your garden layout for the next growing season. So while it's still fresh in your mind, make sure that you're sort of figuring out your plans for next year at least a little bit, or making some notes. And I'm going to pause here and say, if you have not taken advantage of our sponsor's offer from a few months ago, Heirloom Roses, now is the time. Their offer of 20% off by using code JUSTGROW on their website ends on October 31st. And I can tell you the quality of those plants is amazing. I'm going to post a video on my social media channels here soon, but I got my order a couple of weeks ago, and before I could even get it planted, it had already put on new leaves in the 3 days that it sat outside in its pot waiting for me to plant it. And the great thing is, if fall is not the time to be planting roses in your area, you can use that discount now. You can order now, use the discount, and tell them when you want your roses delivered in the spring. I love that feature. I also love that their search function is so robust that I was able to narrow down the selection to the specific strength of scent that I wanted, the color palette, and the fact that I wanted one that would thrive in a container because I have something, very specific that I wanted to plant it in a specific place I wanted to put it. So this was immensely helpful because they have over 700 options of roses on their website. Plus, I just realized that they have flowering bulbs too. All kinds of things. The 20% off works for everything. The website is heirloomroses.com. The discount code is JUSTGROW for 20% off, and you have until the end of October to use that code. So for my gardeners in USDA hardiness zones 5 through 9, so these are people like in my area. You've got Chicago, Illinois, Atlanta, Georgia, Austin, Texas. In these zones, fall is definitely bringing cooler temperatures, and often we're heading into a frost, but it still offers plenty of gardening opportunities, right? So first things first, those warm season crops. You are going to want to start harvesting any of those remaining tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers, anything else that is tender before the first frost. This is the time to really be paying attention to those weather forecasts, right? This is also the time to be trimming the tops on our summer fruiting plants to force energy into maturing the existing fruit, not flowering and producing new fruit that won't get to maturity prior to first frost. So this can be done as far out as 4 weeks prior to your usual first frost date in the fall. Our nightshades are the best candidates for this. So specifically tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. So if you go out and you look at your plants and you see that you have existing fruit already on the plant that are not to maturity yet, go to the next section above, the last of those fruits, and go ahead and just top your plants, okay? Cut those other ones off. You're going to see right now a lot of them are likely trying to do this one last push to get a bunch of flowers put on. None of those are going to make it to maturity depending on where you are. If you are 4 weeks out from your first anticipated frost date, those flowers are not going to produce mature fruit by then. So by cutting off this young growth and eliminating those buds, you're now forcing the plant to put all of its energy into growing out the existing fruits and getting them to maturity before your frost hits, okay? If you can, when you're looking at winter squashes and pumpkins, leave them on the vine to cure until that skin absolutely hardens. You don't want to be able to press your fingernail through the skin. You want it nice and firm. But you do want to make sure to harvest them before that first frost, because that skin and that fruit can absolutely be damaged if it's left out there. So again, this is a really good time to kind of be paying attention to your weather forecast. My rule of thumb is if I see a 3 in any way, shape, or form in the overnight lows, meaning it says 39 Fahrenheit or below. If there's a 3, I am making sure that I have my frost claws and cloches or whatever it is that I'm using to protect my crops from, because I know that oftentimes, A, the weather is unpredictable and that forecast isn't, accurate right down to the individual degree. So if it says it's 39, it could very well get to 34, 33, and that, yes, you're going to start damaging those plants. But I also know in my area that the temperatures bounce right back up too. So if I can cover those plants for that 1 or 2 nights where it's going to get cold, and that gives them another couple of weeks after that where the temperatures are amenable for them to be able to continue to ripen, then I'm going to do that. If I see we're going to have a week straight where the temperatures are going to be in the 30s, then you know what? I'm saying I'm done. And I'm just going to let those summer crops just succumb to the weather, right? I will make sure that I am using row covers and stuff, though, on the cold hardy crops to just kind of extend the season. But the summer ones, I'm just going to let them go at that point. But now is also the time where you can plant more of those really quick maturing cool weather vegetables. So any of your baby leafy greens, spinach and lettuce and kale, fast maturing things like radishes. Depending on where you are, you also could probably be doing carrots. So if you're on the warmer end of these zones, you do have enough time to be able to get some carrots in. And also, if you're like in zone 8, you might be able to overwinter those pretty well too. And at that point, they actually also get sweeter. So if you can get those in, now is a really good time to do that. This is also the time to be getting ready to do your garlic and your onions. So these can be planted in the late fall to overwinter, be harvested in early summer. I'm putting together a video for YouTube specific to fall planted onions. I tracked the process from last fall when I planted my onions all the way through until this summer, when I harvested them and got them cured. I've got the videos all done, but of course haven't had any time to do anything with it. But as soon as that drops, I will let you know. This will give you an idea of how you can plant onions either from sets or from seed and be able to overwinter them so that they come up immediately in the spring. This is absolutely doable in zones 5 through 8. Again, I am in 6B, so I'm kind of smack dab in the middle of that. Just depends on what type of onion you're growing. Either way, garlic. Now is the time to be getting your garlic in too. So if you haven't ordered your seed garlic, get that done and get them into the ground so they get a chance to root and get settled in before the really cold hits. Just like in our previous, discussion of zones 3 and 4, this is also a really good time to be adding a layer of organic mulch. So straw, shredded leaves, pine needles, whatever you've got. That's going to keep the soil insulated. It's going to reduce the weed growth around your fall crops. And it's also going to help to feed that soil as it breaks down over the winter time. This is also a really good time to be doing cover crops. If you want to plant if you want to plant clover or winter rye or hairy vetch, this is now the time to be planting those because that is also going to protect and enrich the soil over the winter. I will leave a link to a previous episode that I did on cover crops to give you something to reference in terms of that. But now, again, fall is a really good time to get that planted, so it helps to hold that soil in place and also feeds and protects the soil over the winter time. Even if you are not planning on growing anything through the fall, this is a really good time to get in and clean up the garden. I generally do this right around my first frost. I find that it makes it a little bit easier to clean things out. I also feel like at that point I've had enough of a break from the chaos of the summer garden to kind of get myself the energy to be able to get back out there, because honestly, I will tell you, there are some places out here right now that are completely overrun with weeds. And I couldn't care less at this point because I just don't have the energy to deal with it. But once a frost hits, it makes it a little bit easier to get in there and remove the spent annuals, any diseased plant material, any of the weeds. We want to do this because it's going to prevent pests and diseases from overwintering in those spaces. And if it's, healthy plant material, if it's not diseased, you can toss it in the compost pile, and that's going to help, obviously, to enrich our soil for the next season. You can also, as long as there's no weed seeds in those weeds, you can also just drop them in place and use them as a natural mulch. I have been known to do that too. And then this is also a really good time to be cutting back any of our perennials like asparagus and rhubarb after they have gone dormant. And if you grow perennial herbs, so thyme or oregano or sage, this is when you also might want to prune them a little bit and kind of, shape them for the next season and mulch the base of the plants for winter protection. Oftentimes, these perennial herbs will tend to get a little bit woody. And so this is a really good time to sort of thin out those woody areas and give space for fresh new growth to come up in the spring. And then, of course, maintaining your garden tools. This is always something that we want to do before we store them for the winter. So if you need to sharpen or clean them or disinfect them so that we don't have any diseases that are overwintering on our tools, because that absolutely is a possibility, this is just going to extend the life of the gardening equipment, and it's also going to prevent us from spreading diseases back into our garden in the spring. Okay, so for my warm climate gardeners, you folks in USDA hardiness zones 10 and 11, so Southern California, Miami, Florida, Honolulu, Hawaii. For you guys, I know I've not gardened in your particular climate. I've done enough research to know that I could be a little bit jealous sometimes of your growing climate. I do know that in these warm climates, fall is actually the start of like the prime growing season. So you don't get a frost and you don't really have a Persephone period. So you're going to have sufficient daylight to be able to grow food year round. This is fantastic. But you still have certain tasks that should occur in fall. This kind of signifies your transition to the best time to grow cool weather crops. So, even though you don't have to worry about a frost, you are having cooler temperatures. And this is about the only time of year that your weather is conducive for growing things like broccoli, cabbage, beets, carrots, spinach. And again, this is going to depend on exactly what your climate is, but you know what your temperature is normally like. This is also a good time for cool season herbs. So cilantro, dill, and parsley that don't really like the high heat. Now is the time where you could start seeds for those as well. Unfortunately, this also means it's a good time for pests to come out. So pests like aphids and whiteflies can actually be more active with cooler temperatures. So this is a good time to start monitoring your garden really closely and use those integrated pest management strategies like using insect netting on the plants that don't require pollinators, planting companion plants that will attract predatory insects, including, introducing beneficial insects if you need to. You can also use some insecticidal soaps and other less damaging means of protection. My go-tos are usually First Saturday Lime or Elm Dirt's Shield when the natural predators maybe aren't present or if I have an overabundance of some pest. The key is to be aware ahead of time of what is prevalent in your area so you can be prepared before you start to see those pests. And that way you've got it on hand when it's time to go. But definitely, I absolutely recommend starting with insect netting, specifically on things that are not requiring pollinators. So your cooler crops, your broccoli, your cabbage, beets, those types of things that also tend to be very attractive to things like aphids and whiteflies. Now, one other thing too, in these warmer climates is if you're growing intensively year round, your soil may need replenishing and there isn't really sort of an end of season. I'm using air bunnies here for you to just kind of go, oh, okay, I'm going to add the compost and let it sit. That does not mean that you can't be doing this continuously throughout the season. You can add compost or aged manure or green materials to the surface of your soil and allow it to naturally break down, especially if you put additional mulch over top of it, because that's going to sort of trap that green material or that compost material in next to the level of the soil, and it's going to help to feed those microbes as it breaks down. It's also going to improve or maintain that soil structure. So this is a really good idea to do a couple of times a year if you are growing year round. And if you're not, if you do take part of the season off, say I know a lot of gardeners in really warm climates don't grow a whole lot through the middle of the summer because it's just too darn hot. That's a good time to be adding, your compost and stuff when the garden isn't actively growing. But if you're growing year round, don't think that you have to have a specific time to add this. You can do this all the time. Just add it to the surface. You can also use a balanced organic fertilizer if you have something that's being planted that really needs that extra boost just when you need it. That's fine. This is also a good time for you to lightly prune any of your perennial herbs or your fruiting plants and trees, your citrus trees. Fall is a really good time to shape your plants without stimulating too much new growth because this isn't their most active growing time. They are still going to grow a little bit just because of the climate that you're in, but it's a good time to sort of get ahead of the game before that growth really starts to spur in the very, very early spring. If you are in a region with a fall rainy season, this is also a really good time to just double check and make sure that your drainage is good. If you have drain tile around the outside of your garden, if you have rain barrels that you use to capture water for using during dry spells, if you have sort of ditches dug around And these are things that are very common if you're in, someplace that gets a lot of rain in the fall. Then just make sure that those are all cleared out. Make sure they're not, jammed up with leaves or any debris that has fallen down. You just want to make sure that you are somehow preventing waterlogged roots during that really rainy season. Using mulch around your plants is actually going to help with this. In addition to helping to regulate the soil temperatures and retain moisture when it's dry, you can also use mulch to help slow down that excessive rainfall, particularly during a dry season or during a wet season. So mulch serves multiple purposes, and I always recommend it. Obviously, now is the time to be adding that. And then, of course, if you're growing year-round, you get to enjoy your continued harvests of things like, tomatoes and peppers, as long as the temperatures remain warm enough. In fact, many of you are going to see this as a burst of growth now because it has finally cooled off enough to be able to allow these plants to continue to grow. If you took a break from those plants during the summer season, now is the time to be putting in starts to be able to take advantage of the more moderate temperatures and be able to grow what the rest of us normally grow in the middle of the summertime. So depending on your growing zone, I hope that has given you an idea of what tasks you should be tackling now in the fall. I know it can seem a little bit overwhelming sometimes because we've just gotten out of the summer season, and for most of us, that is the busiest part of our garden, and we almost feel like we're tapped out. I get it. I totally do. But one last little push in the fall, regardless of whether or not you're planning on actively growing anything in the fall, is still going to benefit our gardens in the spring. If we can tackle a lot of this stuff before it really starts to get too cold to comfortably do anything out there, or if you're one of my more temperate climate growers, or one of my more warm climate growers, I should say, when it starts to get too hot for you to do things in the rest of the season, now is a really good time to just sort of do that one last push and really get things prepped and ready to go to get us through the winter and into the spring again. So until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Just Grow Something podcast. For more information about today's topic and to find all the ways you can get in touch with me or support the show, go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep learning and keep growing.